There is a three-word phrase that almost never appears in the same sentence as a corrections officer: life in prison. Those words belong to the people on the other side of the cell door, the ones the system locked away. So when a federal jury looked at Erin Chararma, a woman who had spent her career wearing the uniform, carrying the keys and enforcing the rules, and handed down a sentence that would keep her behind bars until she drew her last breath, it stopped the entire corrections world cold, because the question was not simply what she had done. The question was how someone given absolute authority over human lives could make the choice to use that authority as a weapon. Erin J. Chararma, born on April 24, 1976, grew up inside a world of structure and discipline. Her father was a soldier in the United States Army, and the family relocated repeatedly across states and even across continents: Georgia, Missouri, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Germany among the places she called home during her childhood. Her maternal grandmother had worked as a state corrections officer, so law enforcement was not a foreign concept. It was practically in the bloodline. By the time Chararma finished high school, a year earlier than her peers, a career in corrections felt less like a choice and more like a natural continuation of everything she had grown up around. She began her career in Washington State in 1997, entering the Federal Bureau of Prisons as a corrections officer. 2 years later, she married Rajesh Sharma, known to family as Roger, who was himself a fellow corrections officer and a former classmate of her brother. They relocated to Edgefield, South Carolina, where Chararma worked at FCI Edgefield. When the couple welcomed a daughter around 2000, they made the decision to move to Florida to be closer to Erin's mother. That move brought her to one of the most consequential assignments of her life, the Coleman Federal Correctional Complex, a sprawling maximum security facility in Sumter County, Florida, the largest federal prison in the entire country. At Coleman, Chararma was no longer a background player. She was an authority figure inside one of the most volatile environments imaginable, surrounded by some of the country's most dangerous inmates. And by February 2005, that authority was about to collide with a personal grievance in a way that would cost a man his life. On February 3, 2005, an inmate named Richard Allen Delano, serving a 15-year sentence for dealing fentanyl, reached through a food slot and grabbed Chararma's arm, bruising it. The incident was minor in the broader scope of what corrections officers face daily. Chararma received first aid and was sent home for the remainder of the day. But as she left that facility, she had already made up her mind. Witnesses later recalled that her parting words to Delano were, "You're a dead man." Most people say things in anger that they never follow through on. Chararma was not most people. Delano had a reputation inside Coleman as someone who cooperated with authorities, the kind of label that in a maximum security prison carries its own dangerous weight. Chararma knew this. She also knew about an inmate named John Javillo McCullough, a convicted murderer whose nickname, Animal, was not given lightly. McCullough had physically attacked every cellmate he had ever been assigned. He was officially on a single-cell hold, a designation that existed for the protection of any inmate who might end up sharing space with him. Chararma used that knowledge not as a safety measure, but as a blueprint. Working alongside her supervisor, Michael Kennedy, she arranged for Delano to be moved into McCullough's cell on March 1, 2005. Before the move, witnesses overheard Chararma personally encouraging McCullough to go after Delano, but to wait for a day when she was not on duty. She then took a 3-day vacation. On March 4th, while Chararma was away, McCullough carried out the assault. Delano was beaten into a coma. He died from his injuries on approximately March 17, 2005, roughly 2 weeks later. When the FBI investigated, Chararma sat down for multiple interviews and denied everything. She disputed the testimony of the agents who questioned her. She took the witness stand at trial and continued to deny her role. Judge James Fawcett, who presided over the case, later found that Chararma had perjured herself on the stand, ruling that her testimony ran counter to overwhelming evidence of her involvement. That finding triggered an obstruction of justice enhancement in her sentencing. On July 29, 2009, following a federal trial in Orlando, a jury convicted Erin Chararma on 2 counts, conspiring to violate Richard Delano's federal civil rights and violating those rights by engineering the assault that ended his life. On October 26, 2009, Judge Fawcett sentenced her to life in federal prison. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the sentence on August 24, 2010. Her supervisor, Michael Kennedy, was separately indicted and later convicted on related charges. What made Chararma's case so chilling to the corrections world was not simply the crime itself, but the cold calculation behind it. She had not acted in a moment of rage. She had waited. She had planned. She had used her institutional knowledge, her position, and another inmate as instruments of retaliation, then taken a vacation to create distance from what she knew was coming. Federal prosecutor Douglas Kern told the jury at trial that placing Delano in that cell was like placing a sheep in a cage with a wolf. He called Chararma the puppet master, and that, perhaps, is what separates her case from so many others. It was not chaos, it was choreography. Today, Erin Chararma remains a federal prisoner, a woman who once held the keys, now confined by them, serving a sentence she arranged for someone else to carry, but ultimately earned for herself. Michelle Goodman. Some institutions carry a name that almost no one outside their state has ever heard, tucked away in a small county, doing quiet and unglamorous work. Green Hill School in Chehalis, Washington, is one of those places. It is a juvenile corrections facility, a place that holds young people, many of them in their late teens and early 20s, who are working through their legal obligations to the state in what is supposed to be a structured, supervised, and safe environment. The staff who work inside it are entrusted with something that carries genuine weight, the well-being of people who cannot simply walk out the door. Michelle Goodman wore that trust like a uniform, and in the opening weeks of 2024, she discarded it, twice, in two entirely separate ways, on two separate occasions, making her one of the rare cases in the corrections world where a single officer managed to stand accused of failing her duty in almost every direction at once. Michelle Marie Goodman was 31 years old and a resident of Centralia, Washington, when her name first appeared in a police report. She had been employed as a security officer at Green Hill School, and by all outward appearances was functioning as a standard member of the corrections staff inside a facility that by 2024 was already experiencing a sharp and well-documented rise in incidents. In 2022, authorities had recorded 15 incidents at Green Hill. In 2023, that number climbed to 74. By the time the events involving Goodman came to light in 2024, the facility was on track to record nearly 3 times the incidents of the previous year. Goodman's 2 cases would become the most prominent in a pattern that exposed deep institutional problems at the school. The first case came to light in March 2024. On January 6th of that year, 2 Green Hill inmates had attacked a third inmate. Goodman was approximately 20 feet from the victim's cell when the incident began. Security footage, reviewed by Chehalis detectives, captured what investigators described as a deeply troubling sequence. Goodman sitting at a table with inmates before the assault, multiple people in the area visibly reacting as sounds came from the victim's cell, and Goodman failing to intervene. Court documents noted that the juvenile inmate who committed the initial assault appeared notably more cautious about a different staff member stationed further away than Goodman, who was far closer. After the assault, according to investigators and witnesses, Goodman was seen laughing as inmates at the table pantomimed and reenacted what had just occurred in that cell. She was arrested on March 11th on charges that included prison riot, abuse of office, and conspiracy to commit assault. The second case arrived before the first was fully resolved. In October 2024, while Goodman was still awaiting sentencing in the assault case, the Chehalis Police Department received information that she had committed serious misconduct of a different kind entirely. Investigators determined that on January 28th and 29th of that same year, just weeks after the January 6th assault, Goodman had engaged in sexual relations with a 23-year-old male inmate inside the facility's staff locker area. Under Washington state law, first-degree custodial sexual misconduct occurs when a corrections employee engages in sexual intercourse with a person in custody who reasonably believes the officer holds power over the terms or duration of their confinement. The inmate's civil attorney, who filed a lawsuit in Thurston County Superior Court, stated that his client had felt unable to refuse because Goodman had the institutional power to affect his situation at the facility.
The attorney alleged that Goodman had pressed the inmate to record their encounters on video. Washington state law is explicit. Consent is not a legal defense under the statute because genuine consent cannot exist where that power imbalance is present. Goodman was arrested on October 16, 2024 without incident, and bail was set at $100,000. Lewis County prosecutors ultimately reached separate plea agreements for each case. In the assault case, Goodman pleaded guilty on July 30, 2024 to 1 count of misdemeanor abuse of office. She was sentenced to 364 days in jail with 363 days suspended and 1 day credit for time served, with the sentence suspended for 24 months on the condition she have no further contact with Green Hill School. A felony charge of third-degree accomplice liability assault was dismissed as part of the agreement. In the custodial misconduct case, Goodman entered a guilty plea on September 10, 2024 to 1 count of first-degree custodial sexual misconduct, a Class B felony carrying a maximum of 10 years in prison, and 2 counts of second-degree introduction of contraband, each a Class C felony. On December 17, 2024, Judge James Lawler sentenced her to 30 months in prison for the misconduct charge, with 12-month sentences on each of the 2 contraband counts, all running concurrently. She was ordered to have no contact with the victim and no contact with Green Hill School. What makes Goodman's case linger in the mind is not simply the nature of the offenses, but their timing. Both occurred within the same month, January 2024, as if the professional and ethical boundaries she had agreed to uphold had already completely ceased to exist for her. One failure might be explained away as a single moment of poor judgment. 2 separate violations of 2 entirely different duties, unfolding almost simultaneously inside the same facility, speak to something more fundamental. A corrections officer who had simply stopped seeing the people in her care as people who deserved care at all. Green Hill School terminated her employment. The state of Washington opened a broader review of the facility's practices. The young man at the center of the misconduct case pursued civil action, and Michelle Goodman, 32 years old at the time of her sentencing, began serving a 30-month prison term at the same kind of institution she had once been entrusted to run.
Brittany Hall was 31 years old at the time of her indictment. A Chicago resident, she had been employed by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and assigned to Unit 12 of the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the 12th floor, the floor reserved exclusively for female inmates. Some of the women held there were awaiting trial, their cases not yet resolved, their guilt or innocence still formally undetermined. Others were already sentenced, serving federal time. In either case, they shared one thing in common. They were entirely under the care, supervision, and authority of the officers assigned to their floor. Brittany Hall was one of those officers. In December 2023, according to a federal indictment filed March 4, 2025, she became something far more troubling. The indictment, returned by a special grand jury, charges Hall with 5 counts of sexual abuse of a ward and 3 counts of abusive sexual contact, 8 counts in total, across 4 separate victims. Federal prosecutors identified the women only as Victim A, Victim B, Victim C, and Victim D. 2 of them were pre-trial detainees held in Unit 12 while their criminal cases moved through the Northern District of Illinois courts. The other 2 were already sentenced inmates serving federal prison time. All 4 were women. All 4 were, at the moment of the alleged offenses, entirely under Hall's custodial and disciplinary authority. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, that distinction matters enormously. It is what transforms misconduct into a federal crime. According to the indictment, the conduct took place across a span of roughly 4 weeks, beginning on or about December 4, 2023, and continuing through December 31st of that same year. One victim was allegedly subjected to multiple incidents across several dates within that window. Federal law is explicit on this point. Any sexual contact between a corrections officer and an inmate is a criminal offense, regardless of any appearance of consent. The law exists precisely because the power imbalance between officer and inmate makes genuine consent legally impossible. What makes the Hall case particularly striking is not only the number of alleged victims, but the fact that multiple incidents allegedly occurred across an entire month without triggering any internal intervention. The Metropolitan Correctional Center had already spent years under a cloud of institutional scrutiny. The facility became globally infamous in August 2019, when financier Jeffrey Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell while awaiting federal trial. A death that raised serious questions about oversight, staffing, and the culture of accountability within the building. For a facility already wrestling with those questions, the Hall indictment lands as yet another reckoning with how deeply the system can fail the people it holds. Hall resigned from the Bureau of Prisons sometime in 2024. At the time of the indictment, she was no longer employed by the facility. The federal grand jury, however, had not forgotten December 2023. On March 4, 2025, the indictment was formally filed. 2 days later, on March 6th, Hall appeared before U.S. Magistrate Judge Heather K. McShane and entered a plea of not guilty to all 8 counts. She arrived at the federal courthouse in street clothes, accompanied by her attorney, Thomas Moore Leinenweber. She remained composed throughout the brief hearing, responding in short, measured statements. Her next court date was set for March 20th for a status hearing. The charges carry significant exposure. Each of the 5 counts of sexual abuse of a ward carries a maximum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Each of the 3 counts of abusive sexual contact carries a maximum of 2 years. If convicted on all counts, Hall could face a combined maximum sentence of more than 80 years. At this stage, Brittany Hall has not been convicted. She has entered a not guilty plea, and the legal process is ongoing. But the indictment itself, built on a federal grand jury's review of evidence and brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois alongside the FBI's Chicago Field Office and the Department of Justice's Office of Inspector General, represents a formal finding of probable cause. The investigation was real. The 4 women named in it were real. And the question of what happened on the 12th floor of a federal building in downtown Chicago across the final month of 2023 is now a matter for the federal courts to resolve. The Federal Bureau of Prisons released a statement at the time of the indictment declaring a zero-tolerance policy for any form of conduct that compromises the safety of those in federal custody. For the women of Unit 12, that statement arrived about a year too late. Not every act of wrongdoing announces itself with a grand plan. Some of the most consequential choices a person makes happen in the space of a few seconds. A door that could have been blocked, a voice that could have been raised, a hand that could have reached out and said, "Stop." Ashley Toney had that moment. She was standing right there inside an interview room at the Southern Regional Jail in Beaver, West Virginia on the afternoon of March 1st, 2022. She could see exactly what was happening to Quantez Burks. She was trained, sworn, and legally obligated to act, and she stood still. That stillness, prosecutors would later argue, made her just as responsible for what followed as the officers whose hands did the harm. Ashley Toney was 22 years old in 2022. She was a correctional officer at the Southern Regional Jail, a state-run facility in Raleigh County, West Virginia. By most external measures, she fit the profile of someone building an early career in law enforcement. Young, part of a close-knit team of colleagues, finding her footing inside an institution that demanded constant vigilance. What the public and even her supervisors may not have fully grasped at the time was the culture quietly taking root on those cell blocks. A culture in which excessive force was not an aberration, but, according to federal prosecutors, something closer to an accepted method of maintaining order, carried out in rooms specifically chosen because they were outside camera range. Quantez Burks was 37 years old. He had been booked into the Southern Regional Jail on February 28, 2022, just 1 day before he died, on charges of wanton endangerment and obstructing an officer. He was, at that point, a pre-trial detainee, a person not yet convicted of any crime, still entitled to the full protections of the United States Constitution. On the afternoon of March 1st, Burks tried to push past a correctional officer and leave his assigned pod. It was a rules violation, the kind that jails handle through standard disciplinary protocols. What happened instead was something the federal court system would ultimately classify as a deprivation of his constitutional rights. Officers responded to the situation, and Tony was among them. Together, the group restrained Burks, placed him in handcuffs, and walked him to an interview room away from general population, and critically, away from the surveillance cameras that covered the rest of the facility. Federal prosecutors described that walk as entirely deliberate, calling the interview room a known blind spot used by officers for the purpose of inflicting punishment outside the reach of any recording. Once inside that room, with Burks restrained and handcuffed and presenting no further physical threat to anyone, multiple officers proceeded to strike him. Tony was present throughout. She did not attempt to stop what was happening. She did not call for a supervisor. She did not report the incident afterward. Burks died from his injuries. He was the fourth of 12 inmates to die at the Southern Regional Jail in 2022 alone, a number that represented a tenfold increase from the single inmate death the facility had recorded in 2018. His mother, Kimberly Burks, would later say of the officers responsible, "They took a piece of her life away that day for no reason at all, and the hurt never faded." In the aftermath of Burks' death, a cover-up began. Former Lieutenant Chad Lester, the senior officer identified by prosecutors as the ringleader, worked to suppress what had happened. Tony later cooperated with federal investigators, testifying against Lester at his trial. A federal jury convicted Lester in January 2025 on 3 counts of obstruction of justice, and Judge Joseph R. Goodwin sentenced him to 17 years and 6 months in federal prison. In total, 8 former correctional officers at the Southern Regional Jail faced federal charges connected to the death of Quantez Burks. Tony pleaded guilty on August 8, 2024, to 1 federal count of deprivation of rights under color of law resulting in physical injury. Her defense attorney, Wesley Page, submitted a sentencing memorandum describing a personal transformation, arguing that the 22-year-old who had stood in that room in 2022 was a different person from the 25-year-old mother now standing before the court, one who had accepted responsibility and testified against her former colleague at considerable personal risk. He asked Judge Goodwin for 5 years of probation. Federal prosecutors argued for 10 years in prison. Judge Goodwin imposed a 78-month sentence, 6 years and 6 months in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. At sentencing, he did not soften his words. He told Tony directly that by her own admission she had known what was happening at the Southern Regional Jail, that she had not merely failed to act in a single moment, but had been part of a broader system in which rights violations and institutional harm persisted. He reminded her and everyone else in that courtroom that pretrial detainees, convicted of nothing, remain protected persons under the Constitution of the United States. And he said something worth repeating long after the sentencing transcript is filed away, that the notion a person in custody somehow deserved what was done to them is not justice. It is something else entirely, dressed up to look like discipline. Tony was 25 years old at the time of her sentencing on June 9, 2025. She is now a federal prisoner, serving time for the moment she chose not to move.
Joyce Mitchell. Ask anyone who has worked inside a maximum security prison long enough, and they will tell you the same thing. The walls do not fall from the outside. The gate does not swing open because an inmate is strong enough to force it. When a dangerous person walks out of a facility like that, it is almost always because someone on the inside let them. Not accidentally, not under duress, but because something happened to the person holding the keys. Something that shifted their loyalties, clouded their judgment, or simply made them forget who they were supposed to be. That is exactly what happened to Joyce Mitchell. And the 23 days that followed her decision to forget would cost the state of New York $23 million, put 2 counties into a state of fear, and end with a man dead on the floor of a forest in Malone. Joyce Mitchell was born in 1964. She grew up in Franklin County in New York's North Country, a region of dense forests, small towns, and long winters pressed against the Canadian border. By 2008, she had been hired as a civilian industrial training supervisor at Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, one of the oldest and most fortified maximum security prisons in the United States. Her husband, Lyle, also worked at the facility as a civilian employee. For years, Joyce Mitchell blended into the background of an institution that had stood without a high security escape for more than a century. She supervised the tailor shop, She was known as friendly, approachable, and, according to coworkers who later testified, far too eager to be liked. In 2012, supervisors began to notice something off about Mitchell's interactions with inmates assigned to her shop. She brought them food from outside, homemade cookies and brownies, ran personal errands on their behalf, and treated two men in particular, Richard Matt and David Sweat, more like colleagues than like the convicted murderers they were. Richard Matt was serving 25 years to life for the 1997 killing of his former employer, William Rickerson, whose body he had dismembered and dumped in the Niagara River. David Sweat was serving life without parole for the 2002 shooting death of a Broome County Sheriff's deputy. Both men were experienced, patient, and skilled at identifying what a person needed to hear. Inmates had a term for the process of winning over a staff member. They called it downing the duck. In Joyce Mitchell, they found a duck that barely needed to be coaxed. A coworker filed a complaint about Mitchell's behavior around Sweat, and prison officials investigated. Nothing was substantiated. Sweat was transferred out of the tailor shop, but Matt remained. And Matt, rather than ending the arrangement, simply became the middleman, passing notes between Mitchell and Sweat, deepening the emotional entanglement from a distance, keeping the plan alive and moving forward. By early 2015, all three were working toward a single objective, getting Matt and Sweat out. Mitchell's role was concrete and logistical. She smuggled hacksaw blades, a drill bit, chisels, and a punch into the facility, concealed inside packages of frozen ground beef that she passed along to Matt. The men used these tools over the course of months to cut through the backs of their cell walls, navigate the narrow utility corridors behind their cells, descend 3 tiers through the building's internal structure, and eventually squeeze through an underground steam pipe that ran beneath the prison perimeter and emerged through a manhole roughly 400 feet outside the facility's walls. On the night of June 5, 2015, they stuffed their prison uniforms with clothing to create the illusion of sleeping bodies, slipped through the openings they had prepared, and walked out. They left a note on a cut pipe that read, "Have a nice day." Mitchell had agreed to be their getaway driver. She had purchased guns, ammunition, camping equipment, and a compass. She was supposed to be waiting at the manhole in a car when they surfaced. Instead, on the night of the escape, she checked herself into Alice Hyde Medical Center in Malone, telling staff she was experiencing chest pains from what she later described as a panic attack. She could not go through with it. Matt and Sweat surfaced from that manhole into a dark street in Dannemora with no transportation, no shelter, and no plan beyond the one person who had just failed to show up. What followed was the largest and most expensive manhunt in New York State history. Over 800 officers from local, state, and federal agencies fanned out across the Adirondacks for 23 consecutive days. The search cost the state an estimated $23 million in law enforcement overtime alone. On June 26, 2015, a U.S. Customs and Border Patrol tactical team shot and killed Richard Matt in a wooded area near Malone after he refused commands to stop. 2 days later, State Police Sergeant Jay Cook spotted David Sweat near the Canadian border outside the town of Constable and shot him twice. Sweat survived and was taken into custody. He received an additional life sentence. Mitchell was arrested on June 12, 2015. She pled guilty in September of that year to promoting prison contraband in the first degree and criminal facilitation. Judge Kevin Ryan sentenced her to between 2 years and 4 months and 7 years in state prison and ordered her to pay $80,000 in restitution for damages from the escape. She was denied parole 3 separate times, twice in 2017 and once in 2019, before being granted conditional release in February 2020 after serving approximately 4.5 years at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She told the judge at sentencing that it was by far the worst mistake she had ever made in her life, and that she would live with the regret of it every day. Whether the regret came from the harm she caused, the lives put at risk, or simply from the moment she realized she had been used by 2 men who saw her not as a person but as a key, she did not say. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is the part of Joyce Mitchell's story that stays with you long after the manhunt naps are folded away and the cameras have gone home.
Vicky White. Most people spend the last morning of a long career reflecting. They drink their coffee a little slower, walk the familiar halls one final time, maybe exchange hugs with colleagues who have become family. On the morning of April 29, 2022, Vicky White did none of those things. She walked into the Lauderdale County Detention Center in Florence, Alabama, signed out a prisoner, climbed into a patrol car, and drove away. Not into retirement, but into one of the most astonishing disappearances law enforcement had seen in years. Vicky Sue Davis White was born on August 19, 1965. She grew up in Lauderdale County, and her life, by most measurable accounts, was one of quiet dedication. She married Tommy White in 2002, though the marriage ended in 2006. She had no children. What she did have was work. 17 years of it, inside the walls of the Lauderdale County Jail, where she had risen from entry-level officer all the way to assistant director of corrections. She had won the department's Employee of the Year award 4 consecutive times and was on pace for a 5th. Judges respected her. Younger officers looked to her for guidance. The district attorney, who spoke with her almost every single day for nearly 2 decades, would later say that he trusted her with his life. By every measure that her profession offered, Vicky White was the model of what a correctional officer should be. None of that makes what happened next any less difficult to understand. Sometime around 2020, Casey White, an inmate serving 75 years for a 2015 crime spree that included attempted murder, was transferred to Lauderdale County to face a new capital murder charge in the stabbing death of a 59-year-old woman named Connie Ridgway. He was 6 feet 9 inches tall, covered in tattoos, and, according to those who observed him closely, possessed a particular talent for identifying what people needed to hear. What began as routine officer-inmate contact gradually turned into something no one inside that facility caught, or perhaps chose to challenge given Vicky's rank. Calls were exchanged outside of work, special accommodations were quietly made, a relationship took shape in the space between authority and consequence, and it grew without detection until it was already too late to contain. In the months before April 2022, Vicky White began making decisions that now read like a checklist of someone preparing to start over from nothing. She listed her 4-acre property for sale and accepted $95,550 for it, less than half of its assessed value of $235,600. She bought multiple firearms, men's clothing, and a secondary vehicle. She told colleagues she planned to retire, submitted her paperwork, and set April 29th as her final day. What no one at the department realized was that April 29th had been chosen for an entirely different reason than the one she gave them. That morning, Vicky White informed a booking officer that she was transporting Casey to the courthouse for a mental health evaluation, after which she would stop and see her own physician because she was not feeling well. Department protocol required 2 sworn deputies to escort an inmate facing capital charges. Vicky White had enough institutional authority that no one pushed back. The patrol vehicle pulled out of the lot at 9:30 in the morning. Neither the mental health evaluation nor the physician's appointment had ever been scheduled. Within hours, authorities discovered the patrol car abandoned in a parking lot across town. An 11-day multi-state search ignited. The U.S. Marshal Service coordinated with local, state, and federal agencies as tips poured in by the hundreds. Investigators pieced together a trail of aliases, purchased vehicles, and motel check-ins. At one point, Vicky White had used a false name to purchase a 2007 Ford Edge, the getaway vehicle from the initial escape. The pair later acquired a pickup truck and eventually a gray Cadillac sedan. By May 3rd, they had settled into a motel in Evansville, Indiana, approximately 270 miles north of Florence. They had been there for nearly a week when a surveillance image from a car wash, where Casey had been spotted cleaning the truck, generated the lead that closed the net. And deliberate. To walk away from everything she had built? Perhaps the most difficult truth her story leaves behind is this: those 2 possibilities are not mutually exclusive. And that is what makes her case not just a cautionary tale for the corrections profession, but a study in how profoundly a person can change, and how few people around them ever see it coming. Stephanie Eileen Lazarus. 23 years is a long time to carry a secret. It is long enough to build an entire career, earn promotions, receive commendations, and be trusted by thousands of colleagues who never once suspected the weight of what you were hiding. For 2 decades and 3 years, Stephanie Lazarus put on the uniform of the Los Angeles Police Department, sat at her detective's desk, and worked to solve crimes, while the crime that defined her own life sat untouched in an evidence freezer, waiting. It waited through her rise through the ranks. It waited through her specialization in art theft investigations. It waited through the deaths of the victims' parents, who never saw justice arrive. And when the wait was finally over, the evidence that ended her career and freedom was not a witness or a confession. It was a bite mark on a dead woman's arm and the DNA it had preserved for 23 years inside a Los Angeles coroner's freezer. Stephanie Eileen Lazarus was born in 1960 and grew up in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. She attended UCLA, where she met a young engineering student named John Rutan. By her own account, and later by Rutan's testimony in court, the two had a casual relationship that continued on and off after college. Rutan, however, never considered her a girlfriend in any serious sense. When he fell in love with another woman, a tall, athletic 28-year-old hospital nursing director named Sherry Rasmussen, Lazarus did not take the news well. She had joined the LAPD by then, 2 years into her career, and she carried both a badge and a fixation on a man who had quietly moved on. Rutan and Rasmussen married in November 1985. 3 months later, on the morning of February 24, 1986, John Rutan returned home from work to their condominium in the Van Nuys neighborhood of Los Angeles and found his new wife on the living room floor. She had been beaten with a vase and shot 3 times in the chest. She was 29 years old. From the very beginning, the evidence did not cleanly support the theory investigators chose. LAPD detectives concluded the scene pointed to a home invasion gone wrong, a theory that gained traction when another woman in the area reported being attacked by 2 male intruders around the same period. Witness sketches were drawn. The burglary narrative took hold. But Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, was not convinced. Almost immediately after his daughter's death, he urged detectives to look into an ex-girlfriend of Rutan's. A woman Sherry had confided to him was appearing at unexpected moments, once even turning up uninvited inside their home. Nels did not know the woman's name. He did not know she was a fellow officer. The detectives he spoke to never followed up. The case went cold. Lazarus continued to build her career. She rose through the ranks of the LAPD, eventually becoming a veteran detective in the art theft division, a respected specialist trusted by her department. Meanwhile, in an evidence storage room, a small tissue sample taken from the bite wound on Sherry Rasmussen's left arm sat frozen and untested, waiting for the technology to catch up with the truth. That technology arrived in the early 2000s. In 2001, a cold case detective noticed a bite swab in the evidence file and requested DNA testing. A year later, the results came back as belonging to an unknown female. The burglary gone wrong theory collapsed quietly and entirely. The question of who that woman was took another 7 years to answer. By 2009, investigators had narrowed their focus to Lazarus. The challenge was extracting her DNA without alerting her. In May of that year, undercover officers followed her to a Costco store and retrieved a drink cup and straw she discarded in a trash can. The sample matched the DNA from the bite mark. Detectives coordinated a careful arrest plan to ensure she could not access her weapon. On June 5, 2009, a detective approached her at her desk at LAPD headquarters and told her he needed help with an interrogation involving a stolen art case, her specialty. She went willingly. In the interrogation room, as investigators began laying out what they had, Lazarus grew disoriented. "Am I on candid camera? This is insane. This is absolutely crazy." She walked out of the room and was arrested in the hallway. She had been an LAPD officer for 25 years. Her trial began in February 2012, 26 years after Sherry Rasmussen's death. Prosecutors argued that Lazarus had gone to the condominium that February morning in 1986 in a state of jealousy and rage, knowing Rutan was at work and Sherry was home alone. A confrontation escalated. Sherry fought back with every ounce of strength she had. The physical evidence told that story plainly.
Lazarus pleaded not guilty and maintained her innocence throughout, offering explanations for every piece of evidence that the jury ultimately rejected. On March 8, 2012, the jury found Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Robert Perry sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison, plus an additional 2 years for the use of a firearm, a total of 27 years to life. Los Angeles Police Chief Charlie Beck called the case a tragedy on every level, acknowledging not only the loss of Sherry Rasmussen, but the department's own failure to follow the evidence 26 years earlier when a grieving father first pointed them towards the truth. Lazarus initially spent years in prison insisting she had done nothing wrong. In November 2020, at a parole suitability hearing, she reversed course and acknowledged killing Sherry Rasmussen. Her admission was met with fury by the victim's family, who said it came not from remorse, but from a calculated effort to secure release. The parole board initially granted parole, but the decision was reviewed and ultimately rescinded in October 2024, after the board determined that her account of events still failed to align with the physical evidence. She remains incarcerated today, serving a sentence for a crime committed the same year she was still a brand new police officer, a woman who swore an oath to protect life and, on a February morning in Van Nuys, took one instead.
Amanda Cook. The uniform carries weight, a symbol of authority, responsibility, and the public's trust that those who wear it will protect rather than harm. But what happens when someone entrusted with safeguarding lives becomes the very threat inmates need protection from? Crystal Ford wore the badge of a Bureau of Prisons lieutenant at the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, Texas. By 32 years old, she'd risen to a supervisory position, overseeing other correctional officers in one of the most challenging work environments imaginable. Yet on June 8, 2017, she would make decisions that betrayed every oath she'd taken, transforming her from protector to predator. The day began like countless others inside the federal facility. Inmates confined to medical observation cells, guards making their rounds, the controlled chaos of institutional life unfolding behind concrete walls and razor wire. Then, an inmate identified only as AA threw a food tray at his locked cell door. Was it frustration? Defiance? Mental illness? Whatever motivated that action, it shouldn't have mattered. Correctional officers face provocations daily. It's part of the job description. They're trained to de-escalate, to maintain professional composure, to remember they hold all the power in these situations, and that restraint defines true authority. Crystal Ford chose a different path. She approached the medical observation cell where AA was secured. The inmate posed no threat. He was locked behind a door designed specifically to contain him. Ford could have documented the incident. She could have initiated proper disciplinary procedures. She could have simply walked away. Instead, she unlocked the door. Then she turns to Senior Correctional Officer Tavoris Botley and issued 3 words that would seal both their fates. Take care of it. Those 3 words carried unmistakable meaning. Ford then stood back and watched, a supervisor overseeing an assault she'd just authorized. Botley entered the cell and struck AA in the head 3 times without justification. The inmate wasn't fighting back, he wasn't resisting, he wasn't presenting any danger whatsoever. This wasn't law enforcement, this wasn't maintaining order, this was retaliation, pure and simple. Punishment delivered by fists instead of proper channels because an inmate had shown disrespect by throwing a tray. But the assault itself was only half the crime. What Ford did afterward revealed the calculated nature of her actions. She sat down and crafted written reports that completely omitted any reference to the assault. She falsified a breathalyzer photo sheet, creating a fictional narrative where AA appeared highly intoxicated during the incident. She was manufacturing a justification that didn't exist, building a paper trail designed to make it seem like any use of force had been necessary and appropriate. This wasn't an impulsive mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was deliberate falsification of federal records to conceal civil rights violations. How does someone in a position of authority rationalize this? Did Ford convince herself that inmates somehow deserve whatever treatment officers choose to inflict? Did she see AA as less than human, unworthy of the constitutional protections every incarcerated person retains? Or was this simply raw abuse of power, the thrill of knowing she could orchestrate violence and then rewrite reality to escape accountability? The Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General eventually uncovered the truth. On May 29, 2019, Crystal Ford pleaded guilty to one count of aiding and abetting another correctional officer in the assault of an inmate. She admitted to submitting false reports in an effort to cover up the incident and make it appear justified. The woman who'd once wielded authority over hundreds of inmates now stood before U.S. District Judge Marcia A. Crone to receive her own sentence. On January 8, 2020, Judge Crone sentenced Ford to 24 months in federal prison, followed by 1 year of supervised release. Assistant Attorney General Eric Dryband stated plainly, "The Department of Justice will not tolerate this abuse of authority." U.S. Attorney Joseph Brown added that Ford's actions hurt more than just the assault victim. They damaged the entire correctional system, undermining the credibility of good officers who perform their duties with integrity every single day. Ford faced a maximum statutory penalty of 10 years in prison and a fine up to $250,000. The court showed some leniency with the 2-year sentence, though even that relatively brief term carried profound implications. Ford would experience incarceration from the other side, no longer the one holding keys and writing reports, but the one being counted, monitored, controlled. Former law enforcement officers rarely fare well in prison populations. Inmates don't forget when guards cross lines. Tavoris Botley, the officer who'd physically carried out the assault at Ford's direction, pleaded guilty in December 2019. U.S. District Judge Thad Hartfield sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 1 year of supervised release in September 2020. Prosecutors presented the case as a betrayal of the oath both officers had sworn to uphold. The Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont continues operating, housing thousands of inmates under the watch of correctional officers who report to work each day to do difficult, often thankless jobs. Most of them maintain their professionalism even when faced with provocations, disrespect, and danger. They understand that wearing the uniform means accepting a higher standard of conduct, not permission to abuse the vulnerable. Crystal Ford's legacy stands in opposition to everything her position should have represented. She didn't just assault an inmate, she weaponized her authority, orchestrated violence, falsified federal records, and attempted to deprive someone of their constitutional rights. The justice system held her accountable, but the damage extends beyond one fabricated report or one inmate's suffering. She eroded public trust, validated every criticism of correctional abuse, and proved that sometimes the greatest threats behind prison walls don't come from those in cells, they come from those holding the keys.